A bear found a woman in the river. Then something terrifying happened. The early morning sun cast a golden hue over the Montana wilderness, stretching long fingers of light through the dense canopy of pine and aspen. Sarah Foster, a retired teacher of 68, inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the crisp mountain air. The scent of damp earth, pine needles, and the faint musk of unseen wildlife was both invigorating and calming. She had spent the last few months enjoying the peace of her secluded cabin, miles away from the nearest town, living the life she had dreamed of since childhood, a quiet existence, surrounded by nature. Today, like many other days, she set out for a hike, her sturdy boots crunching over fallen leaves and frost-tipped grass. The world felt untouched, and Sarah reveled in the solitude. The sounds of rustling underbrush, the distant call of a hawk, and the gentle babbling of the river winding through the valley accompanied her steady steps. This was her sanctuary, the one place where time felt suspended. As she approached the river, Sarah paused, adjusting the straps of her backpack. The water was high today, swollen from the recent autumn rains, its current moving faster than usual. She had crossed this river dozens of times before, always using the old fallen log that stretched across the narrowest point. It was sturdy, if a bit weathered, and had become a familiar landmark on her usual route. Today, however, the bark was slick with ice, a thin layer of frost shimmering under the mid-morning sun. She hesitated, testing the surface with her boot. A slight shift, a bit of instability, but not enough to make her turn back. She had crossed worse. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the log, carefully placing one foot in front of the other, her arms slightly outstretched for balance. Halfway across, the wind picked up, sending a shiver through the trees and a few brittle leaves skittering across the log. Sarah paused, waiting for the gust to pass before taking another step. Then it happened. Her foot slipped, just enough to throw off her balance. She gasped, her arms flailing as she tried to steady herself, but the weight of her backpack shifted unpredictably. In an instant, she was falling. The icy water swallowed her whole, the shock of it slamming against her chest like a physical blow. Her breath whooshed out in a strangled gasp as she plunged beneath the surface. The river was relentless, its cold fingers clawing at her limbs, twisting her like a rag doll as it pulled her downstream. Panic surged through her, the instinctual fight for survival overriding rational thought. She kicked, flailed, trying to orient herself, but the current was too strong. Her hands grasped at nothing but rushing water and submerged rocks. Her head broke the surface for a moment, just long enough to gulp in a breath before another surge dragged her under. She had always been a strong swimmer, but this was different. The weight of her soaked clothes and backpack pulled her down, and the cold was already numbing her muscles, making each desperate stroke weaker than the last. Branches blurred past as she was carried downstream, the world a chaotic mix of sound and movement. Her fingers scraped against a jagged rock, and she latched on instinctively, her body slamming into it with force. Pain exploded in her ribs, but she held on, gasping for breath. The river fought to reclaim her, but she dug her nails into the slick surface, her arms trembling with the effort. Just when she thought she could pull herself up, the rock shifted beneath her grip, and she was pulled under once more. Darkness pressed in, water filling her ears, her vision going fuzzy at the edges. This was it, she thought dimly. This was how she would go. Then something powerful seized her, a force unlike anything she had expected. A rush of movement, a shift in the current, but not the water. Something solid, something alive. Sarah barely had time to process before she was being dragged toward the shore, her body scraping against smooth stones as she was lifted from the depths. Her chest heaved, coughing up water, her vision blurred and her limbs heavy as lead. When she finally gathered enough strength to roll onto her side, her breath hitched at the sight before her. A bear, a massive grizzly, its wet fur dark and glistening in the sunlight, loomed over her, droplets falling from its snout. Sarah's pulse slammed against her ribs. Her body froze, every muscle locking in place as raw terror took hold. This was it. If the river hadn't killed her, the bear would. Its deep brown eyes studied her, unreadable, its breath misting in the cold air. It had pulled her from the river, she realized. But why? She was an easy kill now, weakened, helpless. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it over the rush of the river behind her. The bear did not attack. It did not roar, did not lunge. Instead, it sniffed the air, gave a low, chuffing sound, and took a single step back. Sarah watched, hardly daring to breathe. The bear tilted its head slightly as if assessing her, before settling back on its haunches. The tension in the air was thick, but strangely, not hostile. The grizzly had saved her. That realization sent a new kind of shiver down her spine. Slowly, cautiously, she tried to sit up. Her body protested, aching from the ordeal, but she managed. The bear remained still, watching. A gust of wind swept through the trees, sending a fresh scatter of golden leaves drifting down around them. The bear blinked, then, with an almost deliberate slowness, turned and padded a few feet away before glancing back at her. It wanted her to follow. Sarah swallowed hard, her mind racing. This was insanity. A bear, an apex predator, had just saved her life and was now beckoning her to move. But what choice did she have? She was freezing, soaked to the bone, and miles from her cabin. If she stayed here, she wouldn't last long. With shaking hands, she pushed herself up. The bear gave another chuff and turned, walking deeper into the forest. Sarah hesitated only a moment before taking a step forward. Another. The wilderness had always been her refuge, but today it had almost claimed her. Instead, it had given her something else. A mystery. A question that she would spend the rest of her life trying to answer. And it had all begun with a fall into the river. Sarah's boots squelched against the damp earth as she staggered forward, her body still trembling from the cold that had seeped deep into her bones. Every breath she took was labored, her lungs burning from the shock of nearly drowning. The bear moved ahead of her, its powerful shoulders rolling with each step, leading her away from the river's edge and deeper into the trees. She hesitated, glancing back at the rushing water that had nearly claimed her life, half expecting to wake up and realize this had all been some feverish nightmare brought on by hypothermia. But the cold was real, the pain in her ribs was real, and the enormous creature guiding her through the wilderness was undeniably, impossibly real. It made no sense. Everything she had ever learned, every documentary she had watched, every warning sign posted at trailheads, none of it accounted for this. A bear should not be acting like this. A bear should not have pulled her from the river, should not be walking ahead of her now, as if leading her somewhere safe. And yet there it was. Her legs were heavy, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin, making every movement feel like trudging through quicksand. Her instincts screamed at her to turn, to run, to put as much distance between herself and the predator as possible. But reason held her back. Running from a bear was the surest way to trigger its chase response. Besides, she had nowhere to go. The path she had been following was gone, erased by the river's relentless pull. Her cabin was miles away, and the cold gnawed at her relentlessly, whispering of exhaustion, of sleep, of the kind of stillness that a person never wakes from. She needed warmth, fire, shelter. The bear, oddly enough, seemed to understand that better than she did. She followed at a careful distance, watching the powerful muscles ripple beneath its thick fur, the way its breath misted in the cold air, the effortless way it navigated the dense underbrush. It showed no signs of agitation, no growling or posturing, nothing that suggested she was prey. It simply walked, pausing now and then to glance back as if making sure she was still behind it. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, willing some kind of warmth back into her frozen limbs, and forced herself to keep moving. Minutes stretched into an eternity, her mind clouded with fatigue, her body operating on sheer willpower. Then just when she thought she couldn't take another step, the bear stopped. Sarah nearly ran into it, her sluggish reactions delayed by exhaustion. The bear stood at the entrance of a shallow cave, nestled between the roots of an enormous fallen tree. It wasn't deep, barely more than an alcove, but it was dry, protected from the wind, and most importantly, out of the reach of the river. The bear turned to look at her, then lumbered inside, curling its massive frame into the farthest corner. It wasn't an aggressive movement, more of a silent invitation. Sarah hesitated. Was this some kind of test? A trap? Or had she, in some surreal twist of fate, just been offered shelter by an animal that should have been her greatest threat? She shivered violently, her body making the decision before her mind could catch up. Cautiously, she stepped into the cave, pressing herself against the opposite wall, as far from the bear as possible. The ground was dry, the earth packed firm beneath her boots. She sank down slowly, her back against the cool stone, her breathing ragged. Her body ached, her fingers numb, her thoughts sluggish and disjointed. She needed to start a fire, to find dry clothes, but she had neither matches nor a spare set of anything. All she had was the residual warmth still radiating from the bear's massive body, filling the small space with a heat that, against all logic, made her eyelids droop. Sleep was dangerous, she knew that. Hypothermia tricked the mind into thinking it was warm, lulling its victims into a fatal slumber. But her body wasn't asking permission. Her exhaustion was bone deep, dragging her into unconsciousness despite every protest her brain made. As her vision blurred, the last thing she saw was the bear's dark eyes watching her, unreadable yet strangely calm. She woke to the rhythmic sound of breathing, not her own, the steady rise and fall of something massive nearby. Each exhale a deep rumble that filled the cave. Panic jolted her awake, her muscles stiff and uncooperative as she pushed herself up. The bear hadn't moved from its corner, its bulk still filling most of the cave, but its head was raised now, watching her with quiet curiosity. She expected fear to take over, but oddly it didn't. Initial terror from the night before had dulled into something else. Not comfort, exactly, but an understanding. If it had wanted to kill her, it would have done so already. She was weak, vulnerable, an easy target, and yet she was still alive. She rubbed her hands together, trying to bring life back into her fingers. The shivers had lessened, though whether that was a good or bad sign, she wasn't sure. The bear's warmth had kept the cave from turning into a freezer overnight, and for that, she was begrudgingly grateful. Slowly, she reached for her backpack, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. It was still soaked, but maybe, just maybe, her emergency flare kit had survived. She fumbled with the zipper, her breath hitching as she pulled out the small waterproof case. Hands trembling, she pried it open. The flares were intact. Relief crashed over her. If she could get a fire going, dry out and get her bearings, she might just make it back to her cabin. She turned slightly, eyeing the dry branches scattered near the cave entrance. If she moved slowly, if she didn't startle the bear, she might be able to gather enough to burn. Carefully, she crawled forward, ignoring the way her muscles screamed in protest. The bear's head lifted slightly, its gaze following her movements, but it didn't react beyond that. She worked quickly, piling the driest sticks she could find, her hands clumsy from the cold. Striking the flare, she shielded it from the wind, holding her breath as the small flame flickered to life. The wood smoked at first, reluctant, but then caught, the fire crackling as it grew. Warmth spread instantly, chasing away the worst of the chill. Sarah exhaled, sitting back as the tension bled from her body. The bear huffed softly, shifting its weight but making no move to leave. Sarah watched it carefully, a strange mix of wariness and wonder filling her chest. She had spent her whole life teaching about the world, studying it, but nothing had prepared her for this. She should be dead. Instead, she was here, sitting across from a creature that had every reason to be feared and yet had saved her life. She swallowed, her throat dry. "Ben," she murmured, the name slipping out before she could stop it. The bear blinked, tilting its head slightly as if considering the sound. Sarah let out a breathless laugh. "Ben," she repeated, more certain this time. "I don't know why you saved me, but thank you." The bear didn't respond, of course, but as it settled back down, eyes half closing in the fire's glow, Sarah felt the first tendrils of something she never thought she'd associate with a grizzly bear. Trust. The fire crackled softly, its golden light flickering against the damp cave walls, casting shifting shadows that danced in rhythm with the flames. Sarah sat as close as she dared, her fingers stretched toward the heat, the last of the chill slowly leaving her body. Across from her, Ben, the name she had given the grizzly, rested against the far side of the cave, his massive frame rising and falling with each steady breath. The scent of singed pine filled the space, mixing with the damp earth and the faint musk of bear fur. It should have terrified her, this proximity to something so powerful, so untamed, but instead an odd calm settled over her. The terror of the river, the cold that had threatened to steal her life, all of it had led to this moment, a strange coexistence with an animal she had been taught to fear. She watched him, studying the way his fur, still slightly damp from his rescue effort, caught the firelight in shades of deep brown and gold. Scars crisscrossed his shoulders and muzzle, old wounds that spoke of battles fought and survived. He was older, she realized, his bulk still formidable, but there was something weary in the way he carried himself. A lifetime of struggle in the wild had left its marks on him, just as age had left its own imprint on Sarah. She understood that weariness all too well. With a sigh, she leaned back against the cave wall, exhaustion tugging at her limbs. But she knew sleep wouldn't come easily. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the impossible reality she had found herself in. Cabin was still miles away, and with her supplies waterlogged, she had no food, no dry clothes beyond what was already on her back. The fire would keep her warm for now, but she had no idea how long she could linger here. And what of Ben? Would he simply leave in the morning, disappearing into the forest like a specter of the wilderness? Or had she, in some strange way, become something more than just another passing human to him? The thought was absurd, but then, so was everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. She rubbed her hands over her face, exhaling slowly. She needed to rest, to gather her strength before attempting the long journey home. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, a sharp reminder of the unforgiving wilderness that waited beyond the cave's mouth. She had spent years reading about the natural world, teaching students about conservation, about the delicate balance between humans and wildlife. But never had she imagined she would be sitting mere feet away from a bear, relying on its strange goodwill for survival. Maybe it wasn't goodwill. Maybe she was simply an anomaly to him, something to be observed rather than feared, a curiosity rather than a threat. Whatever the reason, Ben hadn't harmed her. That was enough for now. Slowly she shifted her position, pulling her knees to her chest, the fire's warmth seeping into her bones. Her clothes were still damp, but at least they weren't frozen anymore. The exhaustion was winning now, her body heavier with each passing moment. She allowed her eyes to close, just for a minute, just to rest. The fire crackled, the bear breathed, and somewhere deep in the Montana wilderness, Sarah Foster drifted into uneasy sleep. She woke to the first light of dawn filtering through the cave entrance, soft and pale against the lingering embers of the fire. The air was cold again, but not unbearable. Blinking the sleep from her eyes, she turned her head slightly, half expecting Ben to be gone, to have slipped away into the forest without a sound. But he was still there, curled against the far wall, his breath slow and steady. Relief flickered through her, though she wasn't sure why. She stretched carefully, every muscle in her body aching from the previous day's ordeal. The fire had burned low, the remaining embers glowing faintly beneath a layer of ash. She needed more wood if she wanted to keep it going, but the idea of leaving the relative safety of the cave sent a spike of unease through her. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. Ben's ears twitched at the movement, though his eyes remained closed. She took that as permission to move and crept toward the entrance, stepping carefully over the uneven ground. The world outside was quiet, the forest wrapped in the stillness that only early morning could bring. The river, now calmer than the raging beast it had been, shimmered in the distance, a reminder of how close she had come to never seeing the sunrise again. Gathering what dry wood she could find, she returned to the cave, kneeling to coax the fire back to life. As she worked, she felt Ben stir behind her, a deep, rumbling breath, the sound of massive paws shifting against stone. She tensed instinctively, but forced herself to remain still. He was waking, not attacking. There was a difference. She turned her head slightly, watching as the bear lifted himself onto his haunches, stretching his thick limbs before shaking out his fur. Small bits of dust and dried leaves scattered from his coat, and Sarah found herself staring at the way the morning light outlined his form. He was breathtaking in a way she had never truly appreciated before, not from the distance of a television screen or the safety of a park ranger's warnings. Ben sniffed the air, his dark eyes flicking toward the fire, then to Sarah. A silent understanding passed between them. She was still here. So was he. With a grunt, he lowered himself back onto all fours and padded toward the entrance, pausing only briefly before stepping into the morning light. Sarah swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the pang of disappointment curling in her chest. He was leaving. Of course, he was. She had been foolish to think he would stay, that whatever connection had formed between them in the chaos of survival meant anything beyond that single moment in time. But then he stopped. Just beyond the cave's mouth, he turned his great head and looked back at her. Not a glance, not a passing movement. He looked at her, the same way he had in the river, the same way he had when she followed him here. It wasn't human understanding, but it was something. Then just as effortlessly as he had appeared in her life, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Sarah sat there for a long time, staring after him, listening to the distant sound of his footsteps fading into the wilderness. The fire crackled beside her, the warmth no longer enough to chase away the sudden emptiness settling in her chest. She should be relieved. She should be grateful. She had survived, and now she could make her way home. But as she stared into the vastness of the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had shifted, that the quiet solitude she had once sought no longer felt quite so complete. With a sigh, she stood, dusting off her hands. There was work to be done. She needed to get back, needed to process everything that had happened, needed to find some way to understand what it all meant. But even as she turned to gather her things, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't the last time she would see Ben. Days that followed felt both familiar and entirely foreign, as though Sarah had returned to the life she knew, but had left part of herself behind in that cave, in the river, in the quiet gaze of a bear that should have been nothing more than a fleeting danger. The hike back to her cabin had been grueling. Her body, still sore from the fall, protested every step, but she forced herself onward, driven by the need for warmth, for food, for the safety of walls that didn't breathe beside her in the night. The wilderness had always been her refuge, her solace, but now it felt different. The trees, the sky, the air itself. It all carried the memory of that impossible encounter, of a silent guardian who had pulled her from death's grasp. She had spent years walking these trails alone, had always thought she understood the land and its creatures, but now she questioned everything. When she finally reached her cabin, the sight of its familiar wooden frame should have filled her with relief. Instead, she hesitated at the threshold, gripping the worn handle of the door, as if uncertain whether she truly belonged here anymore. She had been ready to die out there, swallowed by the current, lost to the cold. But she hadn't. She was here, standing on solid ground, breathing air that no longer felt like ice in her lungs, and she owed that to Ben. The thought unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside, stripping off the last remnants of her ordeal, her damp jacket, her torn backpack, the weight of everything she had just endured. The fire she built in her stone hearth blazed to life with practiced ease, filling the cabin with its familiar glow. But it wasn't enough to banish the wildness that still clung to her skin. Days passed, and though her body recovered, her mind refused to quiet. She found herself staring out the window more often than usual, watching the trees as though expecting a shadow to move among them, a great form to emerge from the underbrush. She wandered to the river, standing at its edge, listening to the water whisper secrets she no longer feared. She followed the trails she knew so well, eyes scanning the earth for tracks that didn't belong to deer or foxes. There was no reason for it, nothing logical to explain why she felt this pull, this strange longing to see him again. And yet it was there, woven into the fabric of her days, an awareness she couldn't shake. Then one evening, just as the sun began to dip below the mountains, she saw him, a dark silhouette against the gold and amber of the fading light, standing just beyond the tree line. Her breath hitched. He was there, watching, not too close, not too far. He had come back. Her heart pounded in her chest, but not from fear. Slowly, she stepped onto the porch. the old wood creaking beneath her boots. The space between them felt fragile, like a thread stretched thin across the wilderness. She didn't speak, didn't dare break the spell. Instead, she simply stood there, letting the cool wind carry the scent of pine and damp earth between them. Ben huffed softly, shaking his massive head before lowering himself to his haunches, as if settling in. Sarah exhaled, her fingers gripping the railing, as something unspoken settled between them. He wasn't just passing through, he had come to see her. The absurdity of it struck her, and yet there was no other explanation. She had read stories of animals recognizing kindness, of wolves forming bonds with humans who had spared them, of elephants remembering those who had once saved them. But this was different. She had done nothing for Ben. If anything, he had been the one to save her, to lead her to safety. And yet, he was here. The realization sent a shiver through her, though not from the cold. Night fell, and still he lingered. She watched from the doorway as he stretched out on the forest floor. His great body relaxed, though his ears twitched at the slightest sound. He was comfortable but aware, always aware. Sarah found herself smiling, shaking her head at the absurdity of it all. "You're a strange one, Ben," she murmured, more to herself than to him. He didn't react, but she swore she saw the faintest flicker of movement in his ears, as if he had heard, as if he understood. The hours stretched on, and eventually exhaustion pulled at her limbs, urging her inside. She hesitated only a moment before retreating into the warmth of the cabin, but even as she lay beneath her thick blankets, she knew sleep would be restless. Morning arrived with the soft glow of dawn spilling over the hills. She stepped outside, half expecting him to be gone, to find nothing but flattened grass where he had rested. But he was still there, not in the exact spot, but close enough, moving slowly through the trees, his massive frame shifting between the branches like a phantom of the wild. He wasn't waiting for her, wasn't asking for anything. He was simply there. Should have scared her. Maybe a part of her knew it should. A grizzly bear, this close to her home, to her life. But fear didn't come. Instead, something else settled in its place. Trust, not complete, not yet, but the beginning of something. She spent the day as she always did, chopping wood, gathering supplies, mending the things that needed fixing. But now there was an added presence, an awareness that hovered at the edges of her world. She caught glimpses of him through the trees, a flash of dark fur, the sound of distant movement. He never came too close, never intruded. He was simply nearby, as though this place, this little pocket of wilderness, was no longer hers alone. As the days turned to weeks, a quiet routine formed. Some mornings, she would wake to find fresh tracks near the river, a sign that he had passed through in the night. Other times, she would step outside and see him watching from the ridge, his silhouette framed against the sky. She began leaving small offerings at the forest edge, bits of fish, scraps from her meals, not to tame him, not to turn him into something he wasn't, but as an acknowledgement, a recognition of whatever fragile understanding had grown between them. And each time she did, the food was gone by morning, taken without a trace. The town would never understand. They would call her reckless, foolish. A woman living alone in bear country should fear an animal like Ben, not welcome his presence. But they hadn't been there. They hadn't felt the weight of his gaze as he pulled her from the river, hadn't sat by a fire with him only feet away, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sun fade into deep purples and blues, she saw him again, standing just at the edge of the clearing. A full moon hung above, its pale light catching the scars along his muzzle, the wisdom in his dark eyes. Sarah lifted her mug of tea slightly in a silent toast. "You're not so different from me, are you?" she mused aloud, the words drifting into the night air. Ben didn't move, didn't answer, but he stayed. And somehow, that was enough. Years passed in the quiet rhythm of the wilderness, the seasons shifting in their steady, inevitable cycle. And through it all, Sarah and Ben remained. What had begun as an impossible encounter turned into something unspoken but deeply understood, a bond that needed no words, no explanation. The world beyond her cabin still moved as it always had, Towns bustled with people who could not fathom a woman choosing solitude in the woods, who spoke of bears only in warnings and whispers of danger. But here, in this small pocket of Montana, Sarah had found something greater than fear, greater than logic. She had found trust. Each year, she watched as Ben emerged from his long winter sleep, his form slower now, his scars deeper, his movements more deliberate. Time touched all things, even the strongest among them. But still, he returned. Each spring, she would see his massive frame moving through the trees, watching her from a distance, as if ensuring she was still there. Each summer, he would disappear for weeks at a time, only to return as the leaves began to turn, his fur thickening for the cold that would soon descend upon them both. There was no need for interaction beyond that, no taming, no forced closeness. He was wild, and she was a part of the world he chose to acknowledge. That was enough. But even the most unshakable things in life were not immune to time. Sarah felt it creeping into her own bones, in the slowness of her steps, in the ache in her hands when she split wood for the fire. She was older now, and though she had always known she would spend her last years in this place, she had not anticipated how quickly those years would come. Her hair had turned silver, her face lined with the map of a life well lived. But it was her hands that told the truth. The once steady grip now weaker, the fingers that had built this life for herself now struggling with tasks that had once been effortless. One autumn morning, as frost kissed the earth and the world smelled of damp leaves and distant snow, she made her way to the river, following the familiar path she had walked so many times before. It had been years since she had feared the water, since she had stood at its edge and thought of the day it nearly took her. Now it was simply part of her home, just as the trees were, just as the wind was, just as Ben was. She expected to see his tracks near the bank, as she often did, but as she scanned the earth, her breath caught in her throat. Ben was there, but he was not moving. He lay near the river's edge, his great body stretched along the earth as if he had simply chosen to rest and forgotten to wake. His fur, once thick and rich with life, was now dull with age, his breath slow, too slow. Sarah's heart clenched as she approached, her steps careful, reverent. He opened his eyes as she knelt beside him, and there it was, that same look he had given her all those years ago when he had pulled her from the river, when he had led her to shelter, when he had first chosen to stay. She swallowed against the tightness in her throat and placed a trembling hand against his side. He was still warm, but she could feel the weakness in him, the way his breath rattled in his chest. He was old. She had known this would happen one day, had seen the signs, the slower movements, the longer disappearances, the way his once indomitable presence had begun to soften at the edges. But knowing had done nothing to prepare her. She sat with him for hours, her hand resting against his fur, listening to the quiet sounds of the world moving around them. Birds called from the trees, the river whispered against the rocks, the wind carried the scent of winter creeping closer. And through it all, Ben remained still, his breathing steady but faint. There was nothing she could do, no medicine to give, no way to ease the passage of time. All she could do was be there, just as he had been for her. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky into a canvas of fire and gold, and she knew. He was fading. There was no pain in his eyes, no fear, only the same quiet acceptance that she had come to understand over the years. She stroked his fur gently, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's okay," she said, her throat tightening. "You can rest now." He let out a slow breath, deep and final, and then stillness. Sarah closed her eyes, her hand still pressed to his side, her body unmoving. Grief did not come in a sudden crash, nor in loud cries. It came as a quiet thing, wrapping itself around her like a heavy blanket, sinking into her bones. She had known this day would come. She had known. But that didn't make it easier. For a long time she simply sat there, listening to the world continue on as if it had not just lost something irreplaceable. The sky darkened, stars blinking into existence. The river continued its endless path through the valley. She had once thought of death as something distant, something to be fought against, something to fear. But as she sat beside Ben's still form, she realized it was not an ending. It was simply another part of the cycle, as natural as the changing of the seasons, as inevitable as the falling of leaves. She did not leave him there. With what strength she had left, she gathered stones one by one and built something. Not a grave, not a prison for what he had been, but a monument. A place that marked his presence in the world, that told the earth that he had existed, that he had mattered. When she was done, she stood back, her breath misting in the cold air, and smiled through the tears that blurred her vision. "Thank you," she whispered. Winter came, and with it, the quiet of snow blanketing the land. Sarah spent her days as she always had, tending to her cabin, listening to the wind, watching the river. But now she was alone, truly alone. The emptiness was vast but not unbearable, because in the end, Ben had given her something beyond mere survival. He had given her understanding. And when spring returned, when the ice melted and the world woke anew, Sarah stepped outside one morning to find something that made her breath hitch. A shape, small and golden brown, moving through the trees near the ridge. A bear, not Ben, but something of him, something left behind in the wild, in the endless turning of life. She laughed, a sound both broken and full, and lifted a hand in silent greeting. The young bear hesitated, sniffed the air, then disappeared into the forest. But she knew it would come back, because this was home,